All right, so chapter 5 in your textbook is something that we just talked about briefly, but the end of chapter 5 really goes to chapter 6. So the assignment for tomorrow is to read pages 96 to 102 and do the questions on page 102 in complete sentences. If you get in a bind, I'm not going to collect that tomorrow. So do the test corrections first, and then do the questions on 102. I draw your attention to the slide on the wall. Reverend Andrew Barnaby in 1760 said this: "For fire and water are not more heterogeneous than the different colonies in North America." Okay, can you mix fire and water? Yeah, it's totally opposite, right? Water puts out fire, right? Or fire laps up water if it's hot enough. And then he's comparing that to the colonies. He said the colonies are like that. They're so different from one another. They do not cooperate. He goes on, "Nothing can exceed the jealousy and emulation which they possess in regard to each other. In short, were they left to themselves, there would soon be a civil war from one end of the continent to the other, while the Indians and Negroes would impatiently watch the opportunity of exterminating them all together." So, was there much unity in the colonies? No. Now, one of the things that helped to break that down was the Great Awakening. I just mentioned in my Sunday school class yesterday, as I was teaching on Zacchaeus, I used the sermon that we read together by George Whitefield. I mentioned George Whitefield, and most of them were not aware or didn't remember who George Whitefield was. And I pointed out, if it wasn't for Whitefield, there would have been no War for Independence. Because Whitefield's part in the awakening helped to bring the colonies together. But even with that, they still were not totally together, as Reverend Barnaby's quotation tells us. When we look at the eventual war, the things leading up to it, we're characterizing this as family disputes, because this was not a war of one people against another people. This was a controversy, a conflict that is going to arise within a family. England and the colonies were part of a family. And it's helpful maybe to even understand the relationship as just as they did at the time, a mother country and the colonies, or a mother country and what turns out to be maybe the teenage daughter. Think of it in those terms, and maybe you can understand why there was conflict between them. And in this case, the daughter had grown up without the mother being there, and then is thrust back into the relationship again. So in those terms, you can understand maybe a little bit about what's going on. But what begins the conflict is the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 forbade colonists to settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains. They drew a line right down through the Appalachian Mountains and said colonists are no longer allowed to settle west of that line. What was the purpose of that? Do any of you know? Have you read about this before? What was the purpose, or what do you think might be the purpose of drawing a line and saying colonists are not allowed to go west of that line? What had just happened before this? What had been going on in North America just prior to this? Pardon me? Yeah, or what we call the French and Indian War. And the French were defeated by Britain, so as a result of that, Britain got all of Canada, their control of it, but over whom did they not have much control? They were part of that conflict. The Indians. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to prevent further war by saying, if we keep colonists from going out into the Indian territories, then there won't be conflict with the Indians, and we won't have to go out and send troops anymore, again, out into those areas to fight against them. So the purpose was to diminish Indian conflicts. So they had a picture of Indians attacking some colonists. All right, so the purpose was to diminish Indian conflicts. Now, from the English perspective, did that seem like a good idea? Yeah, because it costs a lot to wage that war, and don't want to do it again. Don't want to have to send troops out into frontier areas to fight against Indians. And so to keep colonists from going there seemed like a really good idea. What did it seem like to the colonists? Yeah. And so the perception of the colonists is that they're being denied westward expansion to lands already claimed by the colonial charters. What do I mean by that? Remember, when the charters were given to the different colonies in establishing them, they had no western boundary. Why? Because nobody knew how far west America even went. So the boundaries they were given had a northern boundary and a southern boundary, but then they said, okay, then they keep going as far as whatever. And so the colonies claimed the lands out there and said, okay, now you're telling us we can't settle lands that belong to us? You know, going back to the mother-daughter illustration, you imagine a teenage daughter, maybe the mother wants to take away the phone or take away some privilege, but it's my phone or it's my room. You ever had that conversation? You can understand how the colonists felt here. Only they had maybe a little more justification than you do. The Boston Gazette wrote this in 1765. A colonist cannot make a button, a horseshoe, nor a hobnail, that's the nail that goes on the horseshoe, but some snootly ironmonger or respectable button maker of England shall bawl and squall that his honor's worship is most egregiously maltreated, injured, cheated, and robbed by the rascally American Republicans. So in other words, they're getting the idea that no matter what they do, somebody in England is going to complain about how it's hurting them, or hurting their feelings, or hurting their business, or whatever, and England's going to step in and somehow restrict the colonists. Well, it didn't stop there. In 1764, the next year, Parliament of England enacted the Sugar Act. This is a cone of sugar. That's how it came back then, not in packets, not granulated. You would scrape off however much sugar you wanted. This is how you would carry it, so as not to lose too much of it. How many of you like to have some of that in your room? Cone of sugar. If you had that, maybe your mother could take your phone, you wouldn't even notice. I don't know. Now, what was this? This was a tariff on certain goods imported into the colonies, such as sugar, molasses, and coffee. So a tariff is a tax on goods that are imported into a place. And in this case, England is taxing these goods coming into the colonies. Now, what was the purpose of this? They're raising money. For what reason would England need money that would relate to the colonies? Had England had any expenditures recently in relationship to the colonies? Exactly. And the English looked at it as they were there defending the colonists. And yet the British people were paying taxes and the colonists were not paying taxes to England. So they're not really carrying their fair share of the burden. So isn't it just that England imposed some kind of a tax on the colonies in order to help pay for the war they just fought to protect the colonies? Doesn't that make sense? If you put yourself in the mother's position here, doesn't that make sense? Yeah. You've got a job, it's time you start paying a little rent, pay for your car insurance, all those things, right? Well, that was not looked favorably upon by the colonists. Of course, taxes usually aren't. But it made it even worse when Parliament followed that up with what was called the Stamp Act. This is a picture of a stamp, or a place to put the stamp. You put the stamp over that. That shows where on the document to put it. And this was a revenue stamp. In other words, a way to raise money. And it was placed upon newspapers, diplomas, and legal and commercial documents. So just about anything that was on paper that was published had to have a stamp for which you paid a tax. Now, what's different about this is that this is the first internal tax. Not infernal, all of them were considered infernal, but what's it mean it's the first internal tax? So that meant that the Sugar Act and any other ones that preceded that were what kind, if they weren't internal? External. So what was different about the Stamp Act in relationship to the colonies than the Sugar Act? Why is the Sugar Act external and the Stamp Act internal? Anybody think of it? Michaela?
Went to the legal counsel in America, so it was okay. Did something about that.
No, it has to do with the tax itself.
The tax money stayed with the colonies and then put it in instead of Britain.
No, it went to Britain.
Like the Sugar Act was like imports and exports from neighboring other countries instead of that directly involved everything Americans did in other countries.
Okay, very good, Alex. This is a tax on things that are totally produced within the colonies. It's not something brought in from outside. That's it. So it's the first internal tax, and that made it even worse. Some people can almost understand taxing imports, but now you're taxing our own activity. That is a terrible thing. And it was noted that this internal tax on the people within the colonies, on what they were doing within the colonies, was being done without their consent, which means that the colonial legislature of each colony had been bypassed. Now, what was the colonial legislature? In each colony, there was a legislature that was elected by whom? How did you get to be in the colonial legislature of each colony? You run in and say, I want to be in. What? How would you get there? No, in fact, this is what's going to cause a problem. They were elected by the people of the colony. So if someone in the legislature, in the colonial legislature, or if the legislature passed a tax, and the people of, let's say, the colony of Virginia did not like that, what would they do? Did they have any recourse? Yeah, next time you vote the bums out and get somebody else in there who will take away that tax, right? Now, what recourse do they have if the English Parliament imposes a tax? What recourse do they have? Can they vote the bums out? No, because they can't even vote for Parliament. You see the issue there? They're being taxed without their consent. That was something that they were not used to. They had ruled themselves for a long time. And so this led to the formation of a group called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a people that got together and said, we're going to counteract this. We're going to speak out against this. And so threatening or attacking the crown-appointed office holders became a popular tactic against the act throughout the colonies. In fact, the day that the Stamp Act was to go into effect, November 1st, 1765, flags were flown at half-mast. Usually you fly a flag at half-mast for what?
Disaster.
A death. So what did the colonies perceive had died? Their freedom, their liberty. In addition, there was not a single stamp commissioner left in the colonies to collect the tax. They had driven them all out. So they had a Stamp Act, but they didn't have anybody collect it initially. This resolution, oh, here's a little cartoon that illustrates it. Stamp Act, this guy says, look, another new tax on us from Parliament. And this one taxes everything on paper, our books, deeds, and newspapers. Why, it even taxes my playing cards and dice. Yeah, whatever's important to you. This was a resolution by the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, opposing the Stamp Act. It says this: we further apprehend this tax to be unconstitutional. Keep that in mind. We have always understood it to be a grand and fundamental principle of the Constitution that no freeman should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent. That's where we get the phrase, no taxation without representation. It comes from this idea. And what's he mean by it's unconstitutional? What constitution is he talking about? Or are they talking about? Did Great Britain have a written constitution like we have in our country today? No. But they had a constitution that was an unwritten constitution. That is, the law of the land of Great Britain, the common law, what had always been believed or what had been followed, the law of Britain. It was influenced by the Magna Carta and other documents as well. But there was this concept of the consent of those who are being governed. Well, that same year, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. About 2 days after the Stamp Act, they passed the Quartering Act. And what this meant was that the people of the colonies had to support the soldiers that were stationed there. Sorry, went too fast. So there was a standing army in the colonies during a time of peace. Now, standing army means that it's a real army. It's really there. It's a fighting army ready to go to battle, and yet there are no battles. Why is the army there? Well, the colonists were to help supply provisions for this army. Well, the conclusion of the colonists concerning this standing army was that they were being oppressed by an unlawful military occupation to enforce illegal taxation. So in the minds of the colonists, the English are just heaping one unconstitutional act upon another. They're taxing us unconstitutionally, and now they're occupying us militarily unconstitutionally in order to effect an illegal tax. You understand the point? There was opposition. Here's a copy of the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. Headline, expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. He talks about the Stamp Act and so on. They put in biblical terms what was happening to them. Here's a picture of the Stamp Act up there. You can see the skull and crossbones. Well, Patrick Henry addressed the House of Burgesses, the Virginia legislature, on May 29, 1765. And in this address, he claimed that Virginians were Englishmen. By virtue of the fact that they were an English colony, populated primarily by English people, that to be a Virginian is to be an Englishman, and therefore to have the rights of an Englishman. He said the granting of the right of taxation to any body besides the Virginia Assembly was an act of tyranny. It's an act of demagoguery, of dictatorship. It is not an act of a democratic or republican form of government. And then Henry added what many considered a treasonous challenge. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell. May George III profit from their example. Now, just to make sure that you understand what he's saying, who is Caesar and Brutus? Have you read Julius Caesar yet? You're reading it right now? So you should know this one then. Who is Caesar and Brutus? Sally?
With Julius Caesar and there's his friend Brutus who then.
What did Brutus do?
So he got like involved with the plot to kill him, which is going to happen.
Not only the plot to kill him, and the actual killing of him. So Brutus is one that killed Caesar. One of the ones, right? Okay, what about, you know anything about Charles I and Cromwell? Charles I was the king that was overthrown by the Puritans in the 1640s. And Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Puritans who had Charles I beheaded. So in both these cases, you have a ruler that was killed. Who's George III?
King of England.
King of England at this time. So what's Patrick Henry saying? Saying, watch out, you may be next. Now, might that be considered treason? A threat? If somebody wrote that about our president, should they be in trouble? Yeah, fortunately, today you're not, but I mean, you can hold up a severed head of the president, and that's okay. And you can advocate people being violent against the president, that's okay. But there are times when that would be considered treasonous. Now, if any of you wrote a letter like that, you would probably be arrested. But anyway, let's not get too far into that. All right, so you can see why people would have thought that he was acting in a way which would maybe require his own execution. All right, the opposition continued with the formation of a Stamp Act Congress in October 1765. This is a painting of a funeral. And it's not as clear as the original, unfortunately. You can see they're carrying skulls. And I think somewhere here there's a coffin. I think that may be it. Can't tell for sure because it's not clear. But again, the demise of liberty. At the Stamp Act Congress, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York to discuss what are we going to do about this. And they formally denounced the Stamp Act. So in other words, they gave a formal declaration, we 9 colonies denounce the Stamp Act. Now, they had no teeth behind it, nothing they could do about it, but that's the first step anyway. And in reality, in March of the next year, the Stamp Act was repealed. Now, if you're a colonist, how might you react to this? What might you think about this? Might you think that might have helped bring about this? That the Stamp Act Congress might have helped bring about this? And kind of maybe embolden you a little bit as to, okay, next time they do something, we'll make a difference? In reality, it had nothing to do with it. Like I said before, they didn't have anybody to collect it. It didn't work. So Parliament got rid of it. It was costing them more to try to collect it. And so it had nothing to do with the fact that the colonies denounced it, because they frankly didn't care. So, the following year, they passed what are called the Townshend Acts. This is named after the financial minister of Britain. And this was a direct tax on glass, paint, paper, and tea. So paper's still included in there, but we have these other items that are being taxed. Included in this Townshend Act was some means to enforce it. They provided for search warrants or writs of assistance. So now, officers of the Crown can actually enter into people's houses and inspect their goods to see whether they have paid the tax or not. These taxes specifically were used to pay salaries of royal officials. And there are some quotes in your book, pages 99 to 101, that relate to this. What was the result of this, these Townshend Acts? There were boycotts. People said, let's not buy any more of these products from England. There were riots, people gathering in the streets, and more troops were sent. Now, the issue was not money. The issue was not money. Colonists weren't concerned about paying the money. Parliament was attempting to centralize authority in London, and it's that to which the colonists objected. In other words, Parliament was attempting to bring all the governmental control under their jurisdiction rather than separated in all the colonies, as it had been for over 100 years. You understand? They were taking away the authority of the colonies to rule themselves and placing it in London. In fact, the Townshend Acts failed to produce revenue. The net proceeds in 1 year were £295. The annual military costs to Britain in the colonies to help enforce this was £170,000. It's costing them way more to try to enforce this tax than what they were getting. And they finally were persuaded to repeal the Townshend Act, except for one part they kept, and that was a 3p tax on tea. And they kept that to keep alive the principle of parliamentary taxation. In other words, what they said was, look, colonies, we're going to take away these taxes, but just to show you, it's not because we don't think we have the right to do it. We're going to keep a small tax on tea, just to show you who's boss. The only reason they took it away, because again, it didn't work. But they didn't want the colonies getting the wrong idea that they could tell Parliament what to do. All right, any questions about where we've been so far? All right, let's go to the next event, and that is First Blood. What's called the Boston Massacre. The atmosphere in Boston was explosive, especially with the arrival of 1,000 additional troops in 1768, many of whom were drunken and profane characters. It was hard to get good people to serve in the British Army. On February 23rd, a British informant tore down a boycott sign, resulting in stones and insults hurled at him. He retreated to his house, where a rock was thrown through his window and struck his wife. Well, he was already angry at being stoned himself, but then his wife gets hit with a rock, and so he fired his musket into the crowd of people outside his house and killed an 11-year-old boy. There had also been confrontations between dock workers and soldiers. You can imagine the dock workers are out there unloading ships, and the soldiers are out there making sure taxes are paid, and there is conflict between them. And the soldiers promised retribution to the dock workers. On the evening of March 5th, a band of 60 patriots gathered outside the British barracks demanding their departure. I can imagine that. A mob is outside where the British soldiers are sleeping, and demanding that they leave. You know, like that's going to happen. They're not going to leave just because a bunch of people are out there saying it. And of course, there are soldiers stationed outside of the barracks, a guard, and the people started throwing sticks and snowballs at the 7 soldiers stationed out there. I can imagine that some of the sticks were probably in the snowballs. I mean, if it was me, I would certainly not just throw snow, put something in it, right? Ice it up real good. Well, one soldier slipped on the ice when he was hit by a stick. And as he was getting up, his weapon accidentally fired into the crowd. Well, at that, the other redcoat soldiers began firing, thinking that they were under attack, I suppose, and they ended up killing or wounding 11 citizens. That night and the following day, 5 died. The first one killed was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who was a black member of the Sons of Liberty. I think you see him here. And that one. This was an engraving done by Paul Revere. Later we'll talk about that. There was a trial of the soldiers. And if you have a trial, you have to have a defender. You have to have a lawyer defending the soldiers. And of all people, the defense was led by John Adams. His cousin is the head of the Sons of Liberty. How popular was John at this time? Not very. But he said everyone deserves a defense. And so he defended the soldiers. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and were released after being branded on the thumb. So I think it was an M they put on the thumb, so it was a permanent indicator that they had been guilty of something. I think that's a good idea. That's a lot better than throwing somebody in jail. Well, tomorrow we'll find out the reaction of Sam Adams to all of this. Don't forget about your assignments. Work on them as you can.